future-proofing your board. We have seen massive instability at a global level in the last 2 years, including geopolitical events, the pandemic, and inflation. But we are also in the midst of a long-term shift arising from political instability and deglobalisation. The increasing investor focus on ESG, notably integrated reporting and disclosure requirements when it comes to climate change and stakeholder engagement, amongst other things, is yet another factor that is changing the context in which boards operate. These trends have major implications for board members, who need to be increasingly sophisticated and effective in ways to oversee risks and strategy for the boards they serve on. In essence, they need to future-proof the board. I'm delighted to talk with Professor Didier Cossin, who is the Director of the IMD Global Board Centre. Welcome to the Better Boards podcast series. I'm Dr. Sabine Dembkowski, founder and managing partner of Better Boards. We make the boards of the most ambitious organizations more effective. Our mission at Better Boards is to contribute to creating better boards. We do this by providing clients with an evidence-based approach for board evaluations and board development programs. We have created an innovative board evaluation platform organizations can access and use as part of a fully facilitated board evaluation or for the internal evaluation of their board or C-suite. Large professional service organizations are also welcome to use our platform. To fulfill our mission, we give a voice to all who care about creating better boards. Didier, it's a real honor to have one of the global thought leaders when it comes to governance on our podcast. So thank you so much for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
It's a real pleasure, Sabine, to join you today.
It's interesting. I mean, when one looks at your CV, you started your career as a professor of finance. What motivated you to make actually the shift to corporate governance and board education?
Yeah, you're right. I was educated. I did my PhD in the world of investments and of risks. And indeed, and I was educated by the best minds of what I would call mathematical finance, right? Some of the Nobel Prize winners around that world of risks. And what I realized, is that risks are not the mathematics of inflation or the mathematics of stock prices or the mathematics of interest rates or even of trades around the world, but they're very linked to the quality of the decision making. We are the number one risk, our ability to decide. And that's governance. And actually, at the same time, I was doing all this modelization, even when I was at MIT and Harvard at the time, I started working on governance. So in parallel to that world on risk, I already had done a paper with a friend of mine on board turnovers at the time. In the 90s, in the early 90s, I started looking already into boards then. And then when I got the UBS chair at IMD, as an institution, had a need for someone who had the technical capability to address financial institutions boards. And so for the last 20 plus years, I've been involved directly with helping boards perform better. So first the financial institutions, then the sovereign wealth funds, and then pretty much, any kind of actor around the world, including the non-profit organizations from, Red Cross, UNICEF, International Standard Organization, to the large actors, the HSBCs of the world, or Temasek, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Singapore, and others.
I mean, it's interesting. You do it at a very interesting time. There is a lot going on out there, isn't there? I mean, we have huge shifts in the global political and macroeconomic context. What do you think are the most important shifts you see that have real implications for the board work?
Well, obviously, it's a polarization of the world. And, the trend towards a multipolar world, especially for the large organizations that I work with, where they need to define their playing field and they need to combine a certain level of prudence with agility. And that's across themes, right? So obviously in geopolitics, it's a very natural one. I mean, Russia is a small actor in the overall world, but still, you look at Shell and its need to move out very fast of some major assets like Sakhalin Energy that produces 10% of the gas of Japan. What does that mean in terms of decision making at the very top? And what does that mean in terms of governance? And how do you prepare for this kind of event in much more massive area like in US-China tension, where we see that polarization happening already? And so one of that is geopolitics, but in many ways you have the same dynamics around climate and the ESG that has become very polarizing as well. And you have that, even I would say in inflation, you have to create a certain level of resilience while building up the agility in front of the big shifts that are happening. And we see that across boards.
You know, when we do these board evaluations, what I've seen in the last 2-3 years, that boards really felt the need to dive down into operational issues. When you look at the agenda, very few boards have actually the time to discuss in depth these larger implications you are referring to here.
It's one of the big challenges, right? Boards are much more engaged than in the past. They need to have more granular understanding while keeping a very high level view. They have to be careful not to be micromanaging. With digital, they have been able to meet much more frequently, but the depth of discussion has diminished, right? So that hybrid models are becoming more frequent, right? Some physical meetings, some digital meetings, but still a level of engagement and frequency that's higher. And, you know, fiduciary responsibility and social responsibility that has increased overall. And how do you navigate that as a board? So it's very intriguing how some of the best-in-class actors are actually funding, you know, for example, sovereign wealth funds now are supporting their board members. In the past, you know, the board members kept quite a bit of independence and they had quite a bit of distance. Now, the sovereign wealth funds are taking a much more active role at both supporting their board members, giving them resources, giving them analysis, strategic understanding of the business so that they can dig deeper, but also putting pressure on the board members to be much more present in the asset. And there is a model of governance that I would call the private equity model, right? That's highly engaged, highly aligned, you know, team building likes. It's a board as a team rather than the classical board type of work, which is becoming quite dominant in the systems of many organizations as well. There's no question, you're right. And there is a big transformation of governance from that standpoint. And it's unclear which model will predominate. But I do think that the classical model of the widely held, publicly listed company of independent directors just there to ask questions and probe management is getting obsolete very fast.
What do you see coming next? I'm sure there will also be a transition period. What are the main things board members today should already be aware of? What do you see coming next?
So I say it's that combination, right, of looking at the big trends and figuring all the activities of the firm, figuring out which ones are exposed and increasing the resilience of the organization through, you know, risk thinking. I mean, risk thinking is very predominant today. Through strategic thinking, of course, now all boards are getting involved into strategic thinking. Remember, Sabine, 10 years ago, that was not the case, right? And now they all want to be kicking in on strategy. But I see now, you know, a lot already on human capital management. Do we have the right culture? Are we agile enough as an organization? How do I supervise the culture from the board? What kind of KPIs do I need in human capital management? Or new areas, right? Including big trends and scenario thinking, right? And figuring that out while keeping deeper knowledge of the organization. So a much more, you know, stretching work than it used to be. And also a sense of responsibilities like board members didn't have in the past. And pressures from all sides of society, from the regulators, which also speaks about the quality of the dynamics in the board and people paying much more attention to that. For example, right, psychological safety on board has become a big topic. Are we able to raise a question, right? Are we able to discuss everything we truly want to discuss? Is there a dominant actor somewhere that puts pressures, that limits the quality of the board discussions? And of course, as you know well, some of the regulators are now looking into that. And for example, the Dutch regulator now doing for financial institutions one by one interviews of the board members with three clinical psychologists for a few hours, each board member separately, right, to test their psychological safety on the board. So I think that combination, right, makes a board work. It makes a board work very interesting, right? At some degree, it's even more engaging than in the past, and it's more powerful than in the past, but it's also much more demanding.
I mean, I have many questions are running through my head, but I try to bite my tongue at the moment and rather ask you first, what are some of the biggest threats you have seen so that boards really start to future-proof themselves?
I think the future-proof board is really what many boards are asking themselves today, right? What do we need to do? How do we play that? I think there are several dimensions, right? If you're looking at board failures at large, I see four big areas of failures, right? One is what I would call the classical risks, right? Having organizations that are not resilient to these risks, that are not prepared to these risks, and that are not able to pull quickly out of risk situations. And of course, the Russian situation, the Russian-Ukraine situation has been one of these tests, but inflation is one of these tests, greenwashing is one of these tests, ESG at large. And so boards are preparing themselves. I was with the board of one of the top ESG player in oil and gas. It's a biofuel producer, well-known company. And even them, and they have a lot of integrity, right? And today they're asking themselves, okay, could we be seen as greenwashing? Is it possible that someone in the organization, tweets numbers or, has pride that's misplaced and that we are somewhat at reputational risk of that? The second dimension is what I would call the strategy, right? But the direction of the organization more than a classical strategic framework, right? Do we have the right values in the organization? Do we have the right vision for the organization? And are we aligning well in our mission as a board? Is our purpose clear? And are we playing our role as a safeguard of that purpose as a board? And I think this is very deep, right? But it engages around values, which is, of course, sensitive in today's world, right? Where, views around ESG, around diversity, around national interest are engaging values in many ways. The third area that I think is very intriguing in today's world is really the quality of the relationship between the executives and the non-executives. How do you foster deep trust while playing clear, separated roles, right? And how do you make sure that your board works almost as a team? Board is not a team, right? But the board works almost as a team in supporting the executives while being smart enough to challenge them individually as well. And so there is something there that's very delicate, right? That well, is about a balancing act that is quite deep in the best boards, and where the quality of the chairwoman or chairman, right, is absolutely central to the success of the governance. And the final area of failures that I see overall and that I'm always concerned with, and that I find we don't speak enough for board, is integrity failures, because we still have that. It's not only, the basic corruptions that you see, and you see in all organizations, by the way, it's still present, right? And it's important to remember that in any large city, even in a city of a few thousand people, right, you do have crime and you do have a police force. And thus, it's normal that in corporate organizations of a few thousand people, you do have crime and you do need a police force, right? And you need a jail, and you need to figure out a system, have an oversight of integrity failures. But more importantly, it's that speaking up capabilities that has to be all the way to the board. And I still see conflicts of interest. I still see tensions at board level, which are of concern. And I still see, people that are not necessarily dedicated to the good of the organizations that are participating there. And we have to challenge that, right? Because the world has become a world that is too difficult to navigate for boards to be compromised in any way. So there is a need for even more integrity, I would say, than in the past, because today's world is a challenging world. And by the way, it's a challenging world for all. I have no doubt that many organizations will do well, but I have no doubt also that we're going to a world of winners and losers, and that some people will be hurt badly, some organizations will be hurt badly, and they will be hurt most often by a failure of governance. In a world of winners and losers, the difference is going to be the governance quality.
I have to say, Didier, I wholeheartedly agree with you. Now, each of these 4 areas you just highlighted, behind each of these areas, it's a huge amount of work. And I see quite often company secretaries would love to touch on some of these areas, but they are sometimes hesitant to put yet another agenda item in the board calendar. How can it be done? How can they really deal with all of these areas? Frankly, they require more than a discussion. Yeah, some of the areas you mentioned require the willingness to actually take time out and dedicate a day or two to work through these issues, because these are complex issues that you highlighted there. What have you seen that some of the best-in-class boards really do?
So very clear answer from my side that is double-sided. The first side is that, the best boards, right, know how to prioritize. And they don't get swamped by, only regulatory compliance, let's say, and get stuck at not being able to discuss the most important topics of the organization. So there is a prioritization of board work. Of course, board work has become more intense than in the past, right? Okay, what truly matters to my organization? Some organizations, are very resilient to risks, and it's more about the strategic direction. Some organizations are very dependent on talent and human capital, and it's really, that human capital supervision. Some organizations are challenged by being involved in worlds and contexts where integrity is a big issue, and then they have that supervision at heart. So the first one is this one. And you know well that this is, subtle. It's not only a board secretary, it's the interaction between the chair and the board secretary and the board members and the executives at large that makes that prioritization possible. But you're right, essential to board work is prioritization. But I would add another dimension that is, in my view, very central to today's world and today's governance. Governance is not the board only. It's not the executives only, as we know well, and we've moved away in the last 20 years, right? But it's also investors, owners, shareholders, and their own engagement. And for example, if you think of ESG as a priority, it's clear the investors' pressure has been central to that, and that the boards were not very engaged around that, and in many dimensions were missing the boat, and that the investors' pressures actually calibrated the board work there. This is something that is happening as well. The engagement of the investors on what the priorities should be. And I think that's very fascinating, that evolution of the corporate world where capital is taking a bigger space than it has for the last 20 years.
Absolutely. I know from feedback of our listeners, they always love to hear a real practical solution. Have you seen anything that really positively surprised you in these best of class boards, a concrete action, or how they solve these issues or how they tackle these issues?
So, I have 2 examples I can give you.
Fantastic.
One is an industrial company that is present around the world. It's called Georg Fischer. It's a Swiss company, publicly listed, where I think the chairman would be comfortable that I describe how he has engaged the board around risk issues For example, I think a good board work on risk is that the board develop its own view of risk, independent from the executive's view of risk. That Georg Fischer is fostering discussion on risk with risk maps put around the room, and the board itself filling these risk maps individually, right? And discussing themselves where, in terms of impact, probability, what risk each of the board members sees, and engaging around that. I think Mr. Serra, the chairman, is doing a wonderful work around that. That's one example. Another example that I would give you, the work done by Neste Oil, the largest biofuel producer in the world, where the board engages around key topics and, a simple workshop of figuring out, what are we faced by, right? CEO turnover, risk of greenwashing, if there is misbehavior in the organization or being seen as a greenwashing. That's one of the organizations with the most integrity that I know, notably around environmental issues. They are one of the leaders and one of the foremost leaders of that world. But, asking themselves, could we still be misperceived, right? And how do we deal with our CEO turnover? And how do we deal with a strategic trend where all the big actors are moving with massive capital in our world? And how do we, as a board, think the future with these three dimensions that are somewhat colliding together? And so an example around risk and an example around strategy, if you want.
Fantastic. No, that's really, really helpful. We could talk for hours, Didier, but we have to come to an end. What are the three things our listeners should take away from this podcast?
Well, I think the first one is very simple, and I invest in it, and I invest for partners in it as well. Governance has become a key driver of performance. Better governed companies perform better. When ESG does not perform better, it's because it's not true ESG. There is no question about that, right? Governance cuts some of the downside risk and increases some of the upside opportunities. And so governance is a key driver of performance. Second, we're moving to a world of winners and losers. In that world of winners and losers, governance is going to be the driver of difference. And so we're going to see more, if you want, difference between best in class and worst in class. And by the way, governance today is transforming. And that's going to be my third point, right? Governance today is not a copy-paste of governance from the past. It's creative, it's agile, it's in touch with our societies, with our stakeholders, and it's inventing new practices around stakeholders, around innovation, around agility, around resilience. And so there is a lot that's being done today in the best-in-class boards that is worth looking into and inspiring oneself of, because that's going to be the driver of difference to the future.
Fantastic. Didier, very big thank you for contributing to the Better Boards podcast series.
It was a pleasure to be with you, Sabine.
How can we help you and your board? We at Better Boards are always delighted to hear from you. You can best reach us at info@better-boards.com. Thank you for listening.